Hello everyone, this is topic 9, direct speech, indirect or reported speech. Introduction. Following the common European framework of reference for languages, the companion volume and the official curriculum for official language schools, grammatical or syntactic competence focuses on the knowledge and the ability to use linguistic structures in order to understand and communicate. This implies that grammar is understood to be subject to communication and is therefore to be taught as a means to an end. Even if the approach we take to language teaching is communicative, functional and also instrumental, the importance of forms can by no means be overlooked. Students need to have knowledge of the linguistic exponents embodying those meanings. From this, it follows logically that forms should also form part of students' total linguistic repertoire. Direct speech. Direct speech provides the exact words that someone utters or has uttered in speech or writing. It's usually signaled by being enclosed in quotation marks. The reporting clause may occur before, within, or after the direct speech. Medial position is very frequent, especially in speech. Special note must be made to the reporting verbs say and tell, which may represent a problem for students. The difference lies in the complementation pattern they take. So, whereas say is a monotransitive verb controlling a direct object, tell is a detransitive verb with both a direct and indirect object. Also, say can take an added oblique object, but not an indirect object. Indirect speech. Indirect speech conveys a report of what has been said or written, but does so in the words of a subsequent reporter. Typically, indirect speech is used to report statements and takes the form of a nominal that clause. Reporting verbs used with indirect speech include those listed as frequently used with direct speech. So, say, tell, claim, state, ask, and so on and so forth. It should be noted that the conjunction that is used to join a reported clause to the rest of the sentence when it is a statement. The conjunction is often dropped, especially after common reporting verbs, such as say and think. Changes in indirect speech. Several changes usually take place in converting direct speech into indirect speech, since the situation of the utterance by the reporter may differ in certain respects from that of the utterance by the original speaker. These differences affect first the tense form of the verb, second the use of dactic features of the language, and last but not least, the people referred to in the utterance. Verb tenses. When the time reference of the original utterance no longer applies at the time that the utterance is reported, it's often necessary to change the tense forms of the verbs. Such a change is termed backshift, and it occurs with verbs of reporting that are in the preterite. It would not occur with present tense verbs of saying. The resulting relationship of verb forms in the reporting and reported clauses is known as the sequence of tenses. Backshift is optional when the time reference of the original utterance is still valid at the time of the reported utterance. As for the reporting verb, it may also be in the present tense for communications in recent past time and for reports attributed to famous works or authors that have present validity. Modal auxiliaries in indirect speech. If the reporting verb is in the past tense, or in other words, if there's a change in time reference between the original and the reported utterance, modal auxiliaries are also backshifted from present tense forms to past tense forms, even if these do not necessarily indicate past time. So, for example, may becomes might, can becomes could, and so on and so forth. In the case that would, might, could, or should appeared in the original direct speech utterance, the same form would remain in the indirect speech. Several modal auxiliaries or marginal modals have only one form, for example, must or need. That form remains in indirect speech, although must in its obligational sense can become had to. spatial and temporal deixis. So if an element is deictic, it means that it has to be interpreted by reference to the situation here and now. Therefore, deixis is a form of referring that is tied to the speaker's context. The most basic distinction between deictic expressions are near speaker versus away from speaker, because the speaker is considered to be the deictic center. So first there's spatial deixis, which is related to the location of one or another or both participants in the speech act as they serve as spatial reference points. And then there's temporal deixis, which is related to the time at which the communicative act takes place. Do not forget that time references also change. For example, yesterday becomes the day before, last week the week before, and so on and so forth. Personal deixis, pronoun shift. If the identities of the person speaking and the person addressed are not identical in the situations of the original and reported utterances, the personal pronouns need to be changed. Pronoun shift requires the shift of first and second person pronouns to third person pronouns, or pronouns if the people referred to in the original utterance are absent in the reported utterance. Nevertheless, when the speaker is reporting their own words, first person singular does not change in the reported utterance. Second person pronouns might also be shifted to first person pronouns. Indirect statements, questions, exclamations, commands. There are 4 different clause types, namely declaratives, interrogatives, exclamatives, and imperatives, which are commonly referred to by the relocutionary force: statements, questions, exclamations, and commands. All the examples presented so far have been indirect statements. However, all the main discourse types may be converted into indirect speech. In this sense, questions and exclamations undergo the same changes outlined before. Imperative sentences, however, do not allow for backshift. Questions and exclamations. Yes, no questions are introduced by if or whether, but it should be noted that if is more syntactically restricted than whether. Therefore, they're not interchangeable all the time in all the contexts. For example, when it comes to the subject, if cannot introduce a subject clause because it could be interpreted as a conditional, and the same thing would happen with the fronted direct object. There's another restriction with the expression or not unless it's postponed, and when it comes to the complement of a preposition, only whether is valid. Open questions are reported as a WH clause, and these are especially tricky for students since they tend to maintain the subject-verb inversion of the original sentence in its reported version. Therefore, special attention should be paid to these type of questions, which are generally introduced in the intermediate level. Commands. When it comes to commands, English offers 2 possibilities in reported speech, either a to infinitive clause or a that clause. In the second case, what's important to highlight is that the verb can take 2 different forms, the form of the mandative subjunctive, which is more common in American English, or the putative should, that is a hypothesis. Free direct speech and free indirect speech. 2 secondary modes related to the primary modes of reporting are free indirect speech and free direct speech. What's common to these 2 modes is that they do not include the reporting clause. Free direct speech. It's an even more direct form than direct speech. Direct speech has 2 key features. That is the quotation marks on the introductory reporting clause. It's possible to remove either or both of these features and produce a freer form, namely free direct speech. Free direct speech is extensively used in fiction writing to represent a person's stream of thought, since the characters apparently speak to us more immediately without the narrator as an intermediary. It's basically a form of direct speech, but it's merged with the narration without any overt indication by a reporting clause of a switch to speech. Free indirect speech. Its most typical manifestation is one where, unlike indirect speech, the reporting clause is omitted, but the potentialities of indirect speech center structures are still retained. Therefore, it's only the backshift of the verb, together with equivalent shifts in personal pronouns, demonstratives, and time and place references that signals the fact that the words are being reported. Very often, free indirect speech involves paraphrase or summary. That is, changes may be made from the original wording without affecting the essential truth of the report. Resorting to free indirect speech allows a reporter a sense of immediacy, not found in indirect speech, and on purely practical grounds avoids continual repetition of the reporting clause. It's used extensively to report speech or particularly in fiction to use the stream of thought as previously mentioned. In conclusion, teaching a language cannot be restricted to the teaching of forms, but rather needs to highlight their meanings in particular contexts. Indeed, as language teachers, we must come to a broader understanding of what it means to teach grammar. Rather than equating grammar to the teaching of explicit rules, we should see it as a means which enables language students to use linguistic forms accurately, meaningfully, and most importantly, appropriately. In short, grammar should be taught through the need of communication, because grammar is important not as something separate from communication, but precisely because it enables or facilitates communication. Obviously enough, our approach to grammar, like everything in language teaching, shall ultimately depend on students' needs and learning styles. Be that as it may, the chosen approach should always keep to the assumption that grammar is primarily a device to enhance meaning and communication. Regarding the teaching of the contents hereby presented, indirect speech is very relevant, since it's very much used to tell stories and report speech or thought. Basic notions of reporting are taught in basic level 2, and it's further studied in the intermediate and advanced levels, laying special emphasis on the patterns of reporting verbs. Its mastery is essential to achieve communicative competence, and it requires above all a good level of verb tenses. The major difficulty for students, as aforementioned, lies in the mastery of the multiple verb structures. It is by extensive practice and the recreation of real-life-like situations in class how we should help students learn this challenging feature of language. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to check out the other topics, like, comment, subscribe, whatever, and I'll see you in the next one.